So today we're going to respond to a viewer question I saw last week, and this is based on the Back to Basics video we made for defensive sets, which you can check out on the YouTube channel. And the question is, if I'm starting a new team, which of the sets that I was discussing should I be considering? So I got Nick Jablonski in here because he's the coach of Tufts. They're a team who runs a few different defensive sets, and I thought he'd be a good person to talk about this. So how you doing, Nick?
I'm doing all right, Ethan. How are you?
Good. So we're just going to take one defense at a time. I think we can each give our own opinion. We'll just move on to the next one, kind of keep it moving pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So let's start out with the most basic, man defense. For what conditions would you, and because you guys run some man defense, would you be running man defense under?
So if you have athletic individuals, if you have a point defender that can constantly apply pressure, man defense is really, really great. But I think everyone should learn it as just a basic level.
For sure. I think in order to run it, it's not just about that one point defender, because like Harvard, for example, has that one great point defender, but you need to have tackling down your roster because teams are going to attack man defense with screens or tap beats that are going to force you into rotations. So your man defense is only strong as your weakest tackler, whereas like a zone might be as strong as your best tackler, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So the next one is a high press, which is just a man form where you're kind of meeting basically as soon as they cross midfield, usually with your beaters and your chasers. So under what conditions do you think a high press is effective?
You have the better beaters in the game. Right. I think that's really the biggest issue. High press is a little different than a standard man where you don't necessarily need to be making your tackles so much as you need to be able to run around with anyone who's trying to reset the ball. Right. And your beaters need to be constantly winning those battles up the top.
Yeah, I think there's an athleticism aspect to needing to have the better beaters in the game too. Like they can't just win exchanges, because if they're winning exchanges the way a lot of beaters win exchanges, they still might not be able to do anything off of that, or they may be taken out of the play if they're playing way upfield. Whereas if you have the more athletic who can kind of win the 50-50s as well and then can press off of that, then you can really run a high press.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important denominator.
Sure. So next one's the caboose, which is the boom train look that started being used last year. It's kind of a man defense nominally because people are kind of manning up, but in some ways it has its own concept because you have your two players on the wing who are manning up but also come to provide help defense. Under what situation would you consider running the caboose?
Non-playing coach. There's a lot of calls in that defense that requires you to engage at certain points where the ball reaches, and that's really, really hard to recognize as a player on the field. You can do it in that situation, but I think that you need to have, even if it's the non-playing coach, you need to have someone on the sidelines calling for those adjustments that need to be made. I think the athleticism thing about it is another thing, because you need to be running all the time and pressing up on that. And again, I know it's hard to say like beaters every time because beaters are such a key part, but the beaters need to be confident playing out in space. Yeah.
And also this was a defense built to counter one specific offense, which is cavalry ball, which is that flat look where the offense has three quaffle players kind of standing across the top, passing back and forth. If someone's giving you more of a diamond or a box look, I think it's really hard to run this defense because this defense isn't great at blocking passes out to the wings then behind the hoops. There's nobody really there to defend those things. So we'll get into the true zones now. We'll start with Baylor zone. Under what situations would you run the hoop zone?
Never now. No,
yeah.
That's a joke.
No, that was honestly going to be my answer.
But I think you really don't need to. I think as long as the hoops are as close as they are, it's really not necessary. The advantages of the Baylor zone that they had were in the time when they ran it. Baylor, specifically, I can't really speak to Minnesota. But Baylor had some very, very athletic point defenders who could just run around on the field all day and create that pressure. And they had two of the best beaters in the game at the time that were just constantly winning battles and forcing that pass into the three congested people by the hoops. And that doesn't really apply in the modern game as well.
Right, and I think the other thing is just like you were saying, when the hoops are this close, because the idea of the Baylor zone, right, is that nobody can shoot on the Baylor zone. You literally have someone standing in front of every hoop. You basically have to dunk through it. And if you have these athletic beaters, they can kind of keep people from being able to do that. But you really only need two people to defend for those shots most of the time if you have competent defending. So using that fourth defender somewhere else in the zone, whether it be a 2-2 or a 1-2-1, which we're about to talk about, I think is a more effective way of playing a zone than Baylor at this point. So kind of getting onto that, let's talk about the 1-2-1. Used to be used by Emerson, now used by Virginia. It's one player up top, two at the hoops, one defending behind the hoops.
I think you need the beaters again. I think it's very similar to Caboose. You need beaters that are comfortable playing out in space because they have to float around a little bit heavier than you do against a 2-2 or a cav wall.
Right.
I think you need to have defenders, and in the back, the defender in the back needs to be constantly moving and communicating. So that's again kind of an athleticism thing. And then you need, with all of these two in front zones, you kind of need that lankiness on at least one of the defenders in front of the hoops to play around that 2-hoop defense.
Exactly, because if you can't defend all three hoops, all they have to do is tap beat your point defenders, get into the lane and rip a shot, and it's going to break down in a hurry. And like you said, it is a lot about beaters because there's way more room on the wings than there are in some of the other zone styles, so you need your beaters getting out to that. I talked about in that video that Emerson, when they used to run it, had Aaron Wohl and Leanne Dillman, two very talented beaters. UVA's two male sets are some of the best sets in college right now, so they get a lot off of that as well. So I think a really good beaters and, like you said, some lankiness around the hoops is both going to be important.
Yep.
So let's talk about a true 2-2, which we don't see much in the U.S. game, but is pretty commonly used in the Australian game.
So in this case, the two off the hoops are playing up pretty high.
Right. They meet like a little bit outside. I would say they would meet slightly outside of the keeper zone as opposed to just falling further and further back like the cav wall.
Yep. Okay. So with that in mind, what I would want is again that lankiness around the hoops to create that issue against shooting, and then a lot of the defenders, you need that confident, those two confident defenders out in space to make their tackles. A lot of the same things you need with man, because you're kind of creating a man front and then sort of a zone-ish back.
Right. Yeah, I think this is what you want in a very drive-heavy meta. Like, if you watch those USA-Australia games from 2018, US tried to keep driving through this, and you basically get met with that first wrap, and then the other player up top steps right into it and hits you as well, and it really shuts down. This is, I think, worse than some of the other 2-2 looks if you're in a more pass-heavy meta, because it does get a little bit condensed horizontally compared to the way like a cav wall or 2-2 hybrid might work. So you can kind of just pass out to the wings the way US would eventually break down the Australian defense in kind of the back half of game one in game two. So I think pass heavy, it's not as great of a zone defense, and in a drive heavy, it's one of the stronger zone defenses. So next up is the 2-2 hybrid zone, which is run by Lost Boys Maryland. Basically, you have two people playing man up top, and you have two people defending the hoops.
So I'd say, again, you need those people who are confident to make their tackles. It's a little different than the traditional 2-2 because that person tends to float a little bit more, that second defender, and tends to mark up on the wings. So I'd say maybe a little bit less physicality from that person in the 2-2. But again, that lankiness around the hoops really helps. I know Maryland runs it with their female chaser at hoops a lot of the time, so they have one of the lankier players to cover the other two hoops.
Right.
In that situation. And then the beaters need to be comfortable, again, kind of playing out in space, but not nearly as much as a true 2-2 or a 1-2-1.
Right, because they will have to step up at times. You definitely need at least two players who are really solid point defenders, right? Because they're not getting much help out there. So if the pass goes to their side, they have to be able to make that tackle in one-on-one. Because if they don't, the zone starts breaking down in a hurry if anybody from the hoops has to step out to it or if the beater has to step out into an uncomfortable situation. I think the teams who run it tend to have athleticism advantages. You talk about a team like Maryland for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking kind of back to the old Lost Boys 2-2 that they ran. You had really great point defenders out there constantly pressuring the ball carrier in the second option.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get to our last defense, the cav wall.
What you need to run it is USQ's current meta.
Yeah.
That's really it. I mean, it's basically you're condensing everyone around the hoops. It's a pretty communication heavy defense in that because you are so condensed around the hoops, the way to break it down requires that you make a mistake rather than necessarily the offense doing everything perfectly. So I think that's a really solid defense to teach in the current meta. but it requires a lot of communication and a lot more than just standing in front of the hoops.
Yeah, it's not just like, hey, here's our defense, we're going to run it. It's, hey, here's our defense. This is what happens when the ball goes to the wing. This is what happens when the ball goes behind. This is what happens if they kind of slowly walk it in up the left side, if they slowly walk it in up the right side. You need to have all those ideas because, like you said, nobody's really found a way to just consistently break down the cav wall. It's doing things that increase the odds that somebody makes a mistake while playing the cav wall. It does help to have beaters who can decently reasonable at getting bludger control while you're on offense, because it's a much stronger defense with two bludgers, and it's also pretty easy to hold bludger control once you have it because you can kind of play conservative with your bludgers. It's definitely really strong for the meta, as you said, as it is right now, and I think that's why a lot of teams are playing it.
Yeah. Is it my favorite defense? Absolutely not, but it is one of the most effective right now.
Awesome. Well, we hope that helped, a little bit of a guide to help with your Back to Basics video. Nick, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ethan.
And everybody have a good day.